are watching Renewed Day by Day with Pastoral LaRosa. This is an online ministry program of Global Mission Fellowship, Lucena City. Join us for today's topic entitled Paul's Joy in Ministry Despite His Circumstances.
Welcome to GMF. We exist to share the good news of Jesus Christ. So once again, we're studying the church in these last days, and I hope you'll follow our prayer agenda on both Wednesday and Sunday morning. There's so many things to pray for. I can't list them here. My good friend Richard Olson in Upland Bible Church in Las Vegas, Nevada. He had a little infection after his operation, but his wife said it's normal and seems to be recovering well. Of course, pray for Ukraine and all of the people connected to that. Okay, so we're talking about, and I just said okay again, sorry. We're talking about Paul's joy in ministry despite his circumstances. This is one of the most powerful concepts, and I don't want to miss it. And so I stole an outline from another pastor, and I made it my own. There's a lot of changes in it. So I can ask forgiveness instead of permission because it's very short. Okay, number one, Paul had joy in spite of his chains, in other words, his handcuffs, 18 inches long, or trouble. And he had lots of trouble, even on the way to what he knew was God's will. Okay? And then second, this is a big one, joy in spite of detractors, as long as Christ's name is proclaimed. You know, there were a lot of Jewish leaders, and Paul loved Jewish people. That was his people, and he loved them. That was his ministry. That was his first ministry, and then God said, you're going to the Gentiles. But he was trained in Judaism. He loved Jewish people. And some of them had come believers, but they also became distractors, because they had different ideas about how the ministry should be done and so on. And so this was a source of pressure for, actually detractors is a good word. They would try to detract him from his focus. He's an incredibly focused apostle, missionary, believer, preacher, whatever you want to call him. He was all of the above. And it was intense sometimes, these detractors. Third, Paul had joy when he faced death, and he constantly faced it. You know, in my lifetime, I can remember several, especially when I was in the Vietnam War, and then other times, and more recently, we think about death a lot now, especially when you're a senior, and then we have this pandemic, and then you have all of these things 24/7 on television and the social media. You can see it 24/7. But Paul had the same thing, and he didn't have all of these things, but he was always close to death so many times. But he had joy in spite of death. And he told us how to face that. As long as Christ's glory is seen, whether he lived or he died, he wanted to honor Christ with his life or with his death. And it was a tremendous perspective that will help us. And then, and this is sometimes misunderstood, he had joy in spite of the flesh. And I'm not talking about the sin nature necessarily, but his human weaknesses. We all have, there's so many, I think of myself, I have so many limitations with language and with culture and with being from a different country. And yet God has surrounded me with some incredible help, just like he had. He was in jail and chained, and yet he had a great ministry, as we're going to see, because he had so many people that saw the need and helped him. And it was mostly Gentiles, not as Jewish people, but Gentiles, just like me. My help is not Americans, even though my biggest partner and biggest help is my wife, dogmatically, without equivocation. She's the most help, but she's only one in many. And she has some of the same weaknesses because we're both in the same culture. So we have to depend on other people. And Paul had joy in spite of his human weaknesses as long as Christ's church was helped. That's our joy. That's our focus. It's ministry. It's not so many of the other distractions and the things that aren't even relevant and the things that really don't matter. And there's so many ways to be distracted. And so he had joy in spite of his human weaknesses. Okay, once again, our focus is on the book of Philippians, although we're going to spend this whole lesson in the book of Acts probably. And it's because that it's the background to this epistle to really understand it. It's so important. And so we're going to, again, focus on Philippians 1:12 through 26, which talks about primarily the joy of ministry. And the reason it's so important to understand the background is because this is one of his prison epistles, and we need to understand what that means. He wrote it when he was in prison, or he wrote it when he was under house arrest. And so we're going to see Paul's message and his mission and his motivation and his focus all the way under all kinds of different circumstances. And yet the whole point, the whole focus, he has the joy of the Lord despite, in spite, despite or in spite of or despite are both correct. I checked with my expert, okay? So they're both correct. We looked it up. It's good. So don't think you don't have to correct my English. Thank you. Okay, you ready? So in Philippians 1:12, listen to this. Again, he's writing this from very difficult circumstances. Now, I want you to know, brethren, and we need to encourage each other as brethren. Love each other, encourage each other, pray for each other, sometimes confront each other. That's right. That my circumstances have turned out, listen to this, for the greater progress of the gospel. And that's what we want to study today. Okay, look at this, Philippians 1:13. Here's his statement to the Philippian church. This is probably 4 to 6 years after he had founded that church. This is long before. He had a time in jail there, but not an imprisonment. And we'll distinguish that. So Philippians 1:13, so that my imprisonment in the cause of Christ has become well known throughout the whole Praetorian Guard and to everyone else, including other detractors, including people that had their doubts about Paul, including people that had a lot of fear because of what was happening. The church was under a lot of persecution in the 1st and 2nd century. Okay, so they had a lot of tense. They had a lot of pressure. Okay, listen to this one, verse 14. Look at what his lifestyle under difficult circumstances, his joy, his ministry, the results of his ministry, just mind-boggling under the circumstances. How could you have a ministry like that? Listen to verse 14. And that most of the brethren, trusting in the Lord, listen, because of my chains, his handcuffs, they weren't ashamed of him. They finally understood that his imprisonment was God's plan. And they now have far more courage to speak the word of God without fear. They said, wow, if Paul can speak under those circumstances and still have joy, then I can still do ministry. Okay, let's continue. So let's look at this and once again, this is what makes the Bible unique to all religious, or if you want to call them supernatural and natural writings, that's holy books that people call them. There's nothing like the Bible because it's his history that we can check out. Okay, so let's talk about Paul's prison ministries that are related to the book of Philippians. We don't want to get off course here. There may have been others. I'll give you the ones we dogmatically know, and especially the ones related to the book of Philippians. Okay, first of all, he had a short time in jail at Philippi. That was Acts chapter 16. Very short. The Philippian jailer, his family became believers. But remember this, before he evangelized them, he went to a lady named Lydia, on the side of a riverbank because that's where Jews met. And remember this statement, to the Jew first and also the Gentiles. He always gave the Jews the first shot. And many times they rejected him, as we'll see today. So let's look at it. Then he was in Caesarea for 2 years. Okay? That was a kind of house arrest. He was actually arrested to save his life from the Jews. The Jews in Jerusalem, near the temple, started a riot. And so he spent 2 years in jail at Caesarea under house arrest. Then later he was under house arrest, a different kind, in Rome for another 2 years. And so the Philippians, the people at Philippi, they hadn't heard from him for a while. They wondered what was going on. Now remember, this is not his final imprisonment where he's executed. Okay, this Roman imprisonment is in a house arrest, probably 62 or 63 AD, because Nero burned Rome in about 64 AD, and he wouldn't have allowed Paul to be under house arrest. He would have had him executed right then. That's what most commentators tell us. His final Roman imprisonment, we don't know the exact time, but we know it was after the fire in Rome, and it was probably 65, 66, or 67 AD. That's when he says, I have fought the good fight, I have finished my race, I have finished my course. Henceforth there's laid up for me the crown of righteousness, when the righteous judge shall give me on that day. And then he was beheaded. Okay, this was not house arrest. It was a horrible imprisonment, and he was not there long. And then this is after his release from the house arrest. Under house arrest, all the commentators seem to think that he was released for a time and able to go out and see I'll give you that history at another time, but it's pretty documented in the book of Acts. Okay? And some of the prison epistles. The prison epistles really describe that time when he was probably released from house arrest until his final imprisonment when he was beheaded.
Thank you for watching. Subscribe to our channel and tune in for the next part of our lesson here in Renewed Day by Day with Pastor LaRosa. God bless you and stay healthy.